And when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. And then she placed the child in it, put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen. I want to make some comments about that as we look from verses 2 and 3 and 4, just about that situation. They're asked those questions. What don't you understand about this passage? We remember from chapter 1 that Pharaoh had commanded all the Egyptians, if you find a child that has been born to a Hebrew who is a male, you are to throw him into the Nile. You are to kill him. And so this was a command for all of Egypt. And so what Jochebed wanted to do was to protect her son, so she hid him. I can't imagine, how do you hide a crying baby for 3 months? But maybe that's part of this child being a fine child. He was quiet. I remember the Christmas songs about Jesus, away in the manger, no crying he makes. That's kind of a joke, because Jesus cried, all babies cries. But she hid her baby against soldiers and other Egyptians that would find out she had a male child. And after 3 months, it was impossible to hide him any longer. Perhaps he became more verbal, or certainly his voice was a lot louder, and they had to do something about it. So she said, let's put him in a papyrus basket. Now imagine yourself, put yourself into the story. You're part of the story. You got Aaron and Miriam, and you got the dad, and they sit down and say, how are we going to hide Moses? How are we going to protect him from Pharaoh? And they sit down and have this little camp meeting and talk about it and say, what are we going to do? Let's hide him in the closet? Let's put him in the attic? Let's put him in the basement? No. All of those places will be searched by the Egyptians. But let's do this. Let's make a basket and make it secure for him, and put him into the Nile, into those reeds, the papyrus reeds, the grasses that grow on the Nile, and let's keep him safe that way. And Miriam can kind of be the guard and watch what's going to happen. And so that's what they did. You can imagine the dad sitting there, and the mother's trying to make a basket, weaving it out of papyrus, and she's not doing a good job. So he gets involved and says, oh, that's not, I'm an engineer, let me handle this. He puts it together. We know that it had a lid, because later on it says that Pharaoh's daughter lifted the lid and saw the baby. So this was quite a basket, and it was pitched with tar all around so it didn't leak, and it had a lid on top. And she placed the child in it and then put it among the reeds. And it was hidden. It wasn't floating out in the Nile and getting away. You remember, the Nile was a delta. It had veins that came off the end into the Mediterranean Sea, and there were lots of tributaries that went off. They were off on the one side of the tributary in the area of Goshen, and we'll show you a map to that in our study guides. You can pick those up on our website. But it's important for us to understand that there were all reeds, and it would be like cattails for us. You go to a marshy area and you find all these grasses and cattails. That's where Moses was hidden. And they placed the child in the reeds on the bank of the Nile. That's important. Go look up the Nile, find out a little bit about it, look at the delta, and then find the land of Goshen, and it will help you to understand the entire story here. Now the sister, we weren't introduced to the sister yet, but we know from the scripture and from our study that the house of Levi, the Levi, Jochebed, and Amram, had 3 children. One was Moses, one was Aaron, and one was Miriam. And Miriam is the one that stood guard over the child. She just was back in the weeds. Perhaps she had a rope or a reed or something that she could pull the basket when it gets too far away and pull it back to herself. So God was supervising all of this. God was overshadowing all this. God was sovereign and leading and guiding, and they were putting a basket in just a part of the Nile. And it's a huge area, but they put this basket in one area and watched what would happen. Then in verses chapter 2 and verses 5 to 10, we find about the baby being lost and found. Then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her slave girl to get it. She opened it and saw the baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. "This is one of the Hebrew babies," she said. Then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter, Shall I go get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you? Yes, go, she said. And the girl went and got the baby's mother, got Jochebed. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you. And so the woman, Jochebed, took the baby and nursed him. And when the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she named him Moses, saying, I drew him out of the water. Now there's several interesting things in this part of the passage. Here we have Miriam kind of feeding out the basket and watching over it as it floats on the water, and along comes Pharaoh's daughter. What a coincidence. No, God was weaving all these things together for their good and his glory. So God was overshadowing. It just happened to be they put it in the reeds in a place where the princess happened to come to take a bath. And she had her entourage around her and her servants, and while they're bathing, one of the girls sees this basket and perhaps draws it over, and everybody's around and all excited. Oh, open the basket, let's see what's inside the basket. And it says they lifted up the lid and they saw it was a baby. And immediately they saw it was a Hebrew baby. Now, we don't know how they identified it as a Hebrew baby. Perhaps they just surmised that who would hide their baby in the bulrushes except somebody that was trying to protect it. Somebody else said perhaps it was the blanket, some of the style in which they had their blankets. And others said, well, Moses probably had a particular look that was Jewish, very different than the Egyptians, and they identified him that way. In either case, they identified this as a Hebrew baby immediately. Now note this, the command of Pharaoh was for every Egyptian who finds a baby boy 2 years old or under to throw him into the Nile. And yet this princess, this daughter of Pharaoh, defies the regulation, defies the commandment of Pharaoh, and instead of throwing him into the Nile, draws him out of the Nile. What a contradiction. What a wonderful mercy of God that God would put into the heart of this young woman to pull this baby out of the Nile and save its life, and not kill it, not throw it back. She took a great risk for herself. Pharaoh could say, off with your head. But in our reading and study, we find out that this was the only daughter of Pharaoh, and therefore he wasn't going to do that. So, interestingly enough, the princess says, well, what are we going to do? And they're standing around. They probably had a long conversation, what to do with this baby. And immediately the baby starts to cry. And they looked at the baby and said, oh, what a wonderful baby. Oh, so cute. Have you ever seen a baby where everybody says, what an ugly baby, terrible baby you got there? Of course, everybody looks at a baby and is touched and they're, oh, so good. And they'll probably say, coochie coochie coo. They probably did in Egyptian too, coochie coochie coo, or whatever the language was. And they were being kind to the baby already. And God was putting something in their heart. And Pharaoh's daughter fell in love with this baby. It wasn't just a, oh, nice little baby. What could we do with it? It was, I don't want to get rid of this baby. I haven't been able to have a baby of my own. This is the God of the Nile giving me a baby. And that's what she assumed because she worshiped the God of the Nile. And then Miriam, listening to the conversation, steps forward and says, can I help in some way? What would you like me to do? Can I go get a nursemaid? Can I get a lady it's got milk and she can take care of the baby? And the princess says, that's a great idea. Go find a mother. So she goes, gets her mother. Her mother comes and probably with fear and trembling thinks she's going to be called on the carpet because she is the mother. But the princess says, hey, I would like you to take care of this baby. I'd like you to wean this baby, feed him, nurse him until the time that he's ready to come to my house. And I will pay you to do it. That's pretty great. Some of you mothers would probably love that. If the queen of the Nile would come up and say, hey, I'll pay you to take care of the baby. This was probably the best paid babysitter anywhere. I think it's interesting that it says that the baby cried. That touches the heart. J. Vernon McGee says it this way. He says, I bet God must have pinched the baby at the right time. And I think that's clever, and it's probably too. God had his hand in this and allowed the baby to cry at the right moment, and not so much that he got to be irritating. And so Pharaoh's daughter drew him out of the Nile, and gave him a name. And now notice, it wasn't Jochebed that gave the name. It was Pharaoh's daughter. So it's an Egyptian name, not a Hebrew name. So she gives him the name Moses. Now the name Moses was common in Egyptian history. We find a lot of the pharaohs had a derivative of the name of Moses. There was Ah-Mose, and there was Tut-Mose, and there were lots of other Moses without the S on the end. And probably the daughter of Pharaoh would have given him an extended name, because most of them were not short names. They were a double name. They had a preface to it. And so Moses was the god of he was born for that god, that kind of idea. And we understand that from Scripture.